He nearly lost the dog first, not to the cold, not to hunger, but to the mountain opening beneath the snow. One step, a crack. The ground gave way, and the German shepherd slid toward a dark crevasse that had swallowed men before. Hold on. Just 2 words. No panic, no prayer. They say this man came to Idaho because the snow doesn't ask about your past. But the past followed him anyway, etched into his hands, his silence, the way he grabbed that collar like he was grabbing life itself. Moments later, the radio inside a forgotten rescue station crackled back to life. A broken voice whispered, "I can't feel my hands." Before we begin, please support the channel by subscribing and tell me, how are you feeling right now and where are you watching from? I truly want to know how far this story can travel across the world. The mountains of Idaho did not welcome him. They stood there in silence, blanketed in white, unmoving and indifferent, like judges who had finished passing sentences long before he ever arrived. The light was thin and pale, stretched low across the snow, as if the day itself had no strength left to give. Wind slid through the valley without urgency, carrying no promise, no warning, only the faint hiss of cold air brushing against frozen ground. Nothing here leaned toward him, nothing pushed him away. The mountains simply existed. Ethan Hawkwood stopped the truck where the road quietly gave up, not with a sign or a barrier, but with the kind of resignation that suggested no one expected anyone to go farther. The engine ticked as it cooled, each sound sharp in the stillness, metal contracting under the weight of the cold. Snow pressed against the tires, packing itself close, as if testing whether the truck belonged here or should be buried and forgotten. When Ethan opened the door, the air rushed in fast and unforgiving, filling the cab with the clean, biting smell of winter and something older beneath it, pine, ice, and distance. He stepped out slowly, boots sinking deeper than he expected, the snow giving way with a soft but stubborn resistance. His shoulders were still broad, his frame solid, but the way he adjusted his balance revealed something time had carved into him. Each movement carried caution, not fear, but the practiced patience of someone who had learned that rushing only invited consequences. The cold climbed quickly through the leather of his jacket, pressing against his ribs, his spine, places that remembered other kinds of weather. He welcomed it, or at least he did not fight it. Beside him, the German shepherd lifted his head once, ears sharp, posture calm and alert. Hunter was 6 years old, large and powerfully built, with a dark sable coat that faded into lighter fur along his chest and legs. His eyes were steady, intelligent, untroubled by questions that humans often carried into places like this. He did not whine. He did not pull forward. He simply waited, breathing evenly, as if he understood that whatever came next would be faced together. Hunter had never asked Ethan where they were going, and Ethan had never needed to explain. People had told Ethan this place did not care who he used to be. No medals would matter here. No stories would earn him warmth or forgiveness. The snow did not respond to explanations, and the mountains did not bend for regret. That was why he came. There were places in the world that remembered too much, that repeated names and failures like echoes that never learned to fade. Ethan had spent years moving through those places, nodding politely, saying less and less each time. Here, silence felt honest. He closed the truck door and slung his pack over one shoulder, the strap worn and stiff from use. The weight settled against his back in a familiar way, grounding him. Ahead, the trail narrowed quickly, cutting between trees that leaned inward as if listening. It was an old hunter's path, barely maintained, shaped more by instinct than intention. Those who had walked it before trusted the land to guide them, not signs or markers, and many of them never left much behind. The path did not announce where it led, and it did not promise that it would lead back. Hunter moved first, nose low to the snow, tail steady and controlled. He did not hurry, but he did not hesitate either, placing each paw with quiet confidence. Ethan followed a few steps behind, matching the pace without thinking about it. The sound of their movement was muted, swallowed by the snow, leaving only the soft crunch of boots and the rhythmic breath of the dog ahead. With every step upward, the air thinned, sharpening the edges of sound and thought alike. As they climbed, the wind shifted, rising from a low murmur to something more deliberate. It scraped against Ethan's jacket, slipping through seams and folds like fingers, searching for a scar they remembered. He adjusted the pack again, then paused without fully stopping, a reflex more than a decision. His gaze drifted backward, not toward the truck, not even toward the road, but into the white space where distance erased detail. Nothing waited there. Whatever he had come to leave behind had already been claimed by the cold. The trail bent sharply, and when Ethan faced forward again, the world seemed narrower. Trees crowded closer, shadows deepened where the light could not quite reach. The mountains felt less like scenery now and more like presence, something aware without being attentive, not hostile, but watchful. Ahead of him, something waited, not a person, not an animal, but the sense that the land itself had noticed his arrival. Ethan felt it settle into his chest, quiet and heavy. Hunter stopped without warning. His body stiffened, muscles tight but controlled, ears angled forward in focused attention. This was not fear. It was recognition. Ethan slowed, then crouched beside him, breath visible in short clouds. The dog's gaze was fixed on a patch of snow just ahead, unremarkable at first glance, no different from the rest of the frozen ground surrounding it. But Hunter did not move, and Ethan trusted that stillness more than any instinct of his own. There, half filled by drifting snow, lay a single footprint. The edges were worn and hard, the shape softened by time and weather, but unmistakably human. It was not fresh. It had survived at least one snowfall, maybe more, clinging stubbornly to the ground as if refusing to disappear. Ethan reached out slowly, 2 fingers brushing the rim. The snow was solid as ice, cold enough to sting through the glove. Someone had stood here long enough to leave a mark. Someone had passed through this place and carried on. But the trail did not continue. Ethan studied the surrounding ground, scanning for the subtle disturbances that told stories the untrained eye missed. Nothing followed, no second step, no drag, no stumble, no sign of return. The wind rose again, stronger this time, carrying a low, hollow sound through the trees. Hunter released a quiet, throaty breath, not a growl, but a warning meant only for those who knew how to listen. Ethan straightened slowly, the weight in his chest settling into something colder and more deliberate. Someone had come this way, and they had not gone back. The mountains remained silent. They offered no explanation, no judgment, no mercy. They simply stood, watching, as they always had. The trail refused to behave like a path meant for remembering. It revealed itself in fragments, then erased those fragments without apology, leaving behind only suggestions of direction. A footprint would appear, then soften, then dissolve entirely beneath drifting snow, as if the ground itself were undecided about whether the story should continue. Ethan moved forward anyway, not trusting what he saw so much as what felt wrong when something was missing. He counted his steps without meaning to, marking distance the way he once measured time, quietly, carefully, aware that stopping was often more dangerous than continuing. He studied the snow the way some men studied faces, reading the way it curved around stones and tightened near exposed roots. This was not fresh panic, not the chaos of someone running blindly. It was exhaustion, older and more deliberate, the kind that settled into the body and whispered permission to rest. Ethan had heard that voice before, in places far from snow, far from mountains. It always sounded reasonable, almost kind, and it always arrived just before things went wrong. He tightened his grip on the strap of his pack and kept walking. Hunter moved ahead at a slower pace now, his broad frame steady but less eager than before. His breath rose in short, pale clouds, drifting briefly before vanishing into the air. Every few steps he glanced back, not to seek approval, but to confirm presence, to ensure that the distance between them remained intact. There was a rhythm to it, a silent exchange that required no words. Ethan answered each glance by simply being there. The wind narrowed as the trail climbed, funneled between rock and timber until it cut with sharper edges. Snow whispered along the ground, sliding across ice with a sound that felt almost intentional. Ethan paused once, listening, letting the silence rearrange itself around him. Somewhere deeper in the valley, something shifted, an echo too low and too distant to identify. It reminded him of nights when the ground itself seemed to breathe, and he felt his jaw set without realizing why. Hunter stopped beside a stand of pines, lowering his head and circling once before freezing in place. Ethan stepped closer, eyes scanning the base of the tree, and saw it half buried where fallen needles met the snow. A strip of fabric, torn unevenly, its color dulled by time and weather. Red, but not the red of urgency, not the red that still held warmth. This red had been waiting. Ethan knelt and lifted it carefully. The cloth was thin between his fingers, worn smooth in places, the kind of material chosen for convenience rather than durability. Civilian, inexpensive, something bought without expectation of surviving long. He closed his hand around it, feeling the cold seep through the glove, then slipped it into his pocket without comment. Hunter watched, ears angled slightly back, reading Ethan's stillness. The trail grew narrower after that, pressed tight against the slope until there was little room for error. Wind carved along the ridge like a blade dragged repeatedly over the same edge, sharpening itself with every pass. Far below, ice cracked and shifted, the sound traveling upward through layers of snow like distant thunder, swallowed before it could speak. Ethan felt the vibration through his boots. Faint but unmistakable. The mountain was adjusting its weight. Hunter slowed again, then stopped entirely. This time there was no tension in his stance, no low sound of warning. He sat. Ethan followed the line of his gaze downward, careful not to rush the movement. Below the ridge, the snow dipped inward in a shallow depression, subtle enough to be missed by anyone who wasn't looking for absence. It was not quite a fall. Not yet. Someone had slipped there. The marks suggested an attempt to stop, a moment of resistance that failed to hold. Ethan studied the angle, the distance, the way the snow had compressed and then relaxed. He had seen this shape before, in other places with different names. The environment changed, but the ending rarely did. His jaw tightened, the muscles along his neck drawing taut as memory pressed forward without invitation. They never find the ones who stop trying. The thought arrived whole, fully formed, and lingered longer than he liked. Ethan forced his attention back to the present, scanning the ridge, measuring the wind, the slope, the silence. Hunter remained seated, calm but alert, as if waiting for confirmation that Ethan understood what the ground was saying. Above them, the sky thickened, clouds pressing low enough to steal depth from the landscape. Visibility narrowed, not suddenly, but with patient intent. The wind rose again, stronger now, pushing at their balance and tugging at loose snow. Hunter stood, shifting his weight forward, and took one careful step. The surface beneath his front paws sagged, just slightly, enough to betray what lay beneath. Time compressed into something thin and fragile. Ethan moved without thought. His body dropped forward, knees striking ice as his hand closed around Hunter's fur. The ground gave way beneath the dog's weight, snow collapsing inward with a hollow rush that revealed darkness below. A crevasse, masked by weeks of drifting snow, opened its mouth without warning. Hunter's claws scraped against exposed ice, the sound sharp and desperate, his weight pulling forward as gravity claimed its due. Ethan's boots slid, his balance pitched toward the opening as the mountain took what it could. His muscles burned, every joint straining under the sudden demand. For a moment, neither man nor dog moved, suspended in a fragile negotiation between force and refusal. The wind howled, filling the space with noise, but Ethan heard nothing but his own breath and the scrape of claws. Then Hunter found purchase. The dog's body shifted, muscles bunching as his paws locked against the ice. Ethan leaned back, drawing strength from somewhere older than fatigue, pulling inch by inch until the weight eased. Together they retreated from the edge, collapsing into the snow in a tangle of breath and heat. Their foreheads nearly touched, steam rising between them, the space intimate and unguarded. Ethan pressed his forehead to Hunter's, eyes closed, the contact brief but absolute. No words passed between them. None were needed. The mountain had tested their bond, measuring trust and response with cold precision. And as the wind swept over the ridge again, it was clear that the mountain had not yet finished asking its questions. The storm arrived without ceremony. One moment the air held its breath, and the next it broke apart, snow rushing sideways with such force that distance collapsed into a narrow, blinding corridor. The world shrank until there was only white in front of Ethan's eyes and the sound of wind tearing through the trees like fabric under strain. The trail vanished as if it had never agreed to exist, erased by movement rather than time. Direction stopped being something you followed and became something you remembered. Ethan lowered his head and leaned into the wind, boots searching for purchase that no longer announced itself. Each step was a negotiation, a question asked of the ground that did not always answer. Snow struck his face hard enough to sting, finding its way into seams and folds with quiet persistence. Hunter stayed close now. His body angled against the gusts, shoulders squared as if bracing against something alive. The storm did not feel random. It felt intentional. They found shelter beneath a rock overhang where the mountain bent inward, offering just enough protection to keep the wind from fully claiming them. The space was shallow and uneven, the stone above them layered with ice that creaked softly under the storm's pressure. Snow piled quickly at the edges, climbing inch by inch as if curious how much room it had been given. The sound here was different, muted but heavy, like breath trapped behind clenched teeth. Ethan crouched low, pressing his back to the rock, letting the shelter decide how long it would hold. Hunter settled beside him, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, despite the chaos outside. Ethan reached for the dog's front paw, turning it carefully in his gloved hands. One pad was torn, a thin line of blood darkening the fur around it, already beginning to freeze at the edges. It was not severe, not yet, but it was enough to matter. Ethan moved slowly, deliberately, as if speed itself might invite more damage. He cleaned the wound with snow, then wrapped it with practiced care, fingers steady despite the cold creeping into his joints. Every movement was intentional, measured, the kind learned through repetition rather than instruction. This was not the first time he had bound something bleeding while refusing to think about everything else that had bled under his hands. The ritual mattered more than the outcome. It kept his thoughts from wandering into places that did not belong here. Hunter lay down once the wrapping was finished, eyes open, fixed on Ethan's face. There was no fear in them, no weakness, only attention. He did not whine or shift, did not test the injury or ask for reassurance. He waited, the way dogs do when they trust that waiting is the right thing. Ethan exhaled slowly, realizing only then how tightly he had been holding his breath. Time passed differently inside the shelter. The storm spoke louder than thought, filling the space with constant movement that made minutes stretch and compress without warning. Snow continued to rise at the edges of the overhang, threatening to close the opening if the wind shifted just enough. Ethan watched it build, his eyes tracking each subtle change, each small surrender of space. He counted the seconds between stronger gusts, listening for patterns that might offer a window to move. As the cold deepened, a memory surfaced without permission. Another storm, years ago, in a place where the ground did not forgive mistakes. Darkness, noise. A voice on the radio arriving too late to change anything. The memory did not come with images so much as sensation, the familiar tightening in his chest, the way his hands had clenched then just as they clenched now. He forced his fingers to relax, pressing them flat against the rock until the present pushed back. Hunter shifted closer, his weight settling gently against Ethan's leg. It was not an attempt to climb, not a demand for warmth, just contact, pressure, heat, enough to remind Ethan that the storm outside was not the only force at work. He rested his hand briefly on the dog's shoulder, feeling muscle beneath fur, solid and alive. His breathing slowed, matching Hunter's without effort. When the storm finally began to thin, it did so unevenly, the wind losing strength in fragments rather than surrendering all at once. The snow fell straighter now, less violent, revealing shapes beyond the shelter that had not been visible before. Ethan leaned forward, squinting through the white, scanning the slope below. The world did not return all at once, it offered pieces. At first it was only a line that did not belong, too straight, too deliberate. Nature favored curves even in its harshest expressions, but this shape resisted that logic. Ethan stood slowly, careful not to slip, and took a few steps forward to clear the edge of the overhang. The storm's retreat revealed more of the outline with each passing second, a structure half buried in snow, its roof sagging under accumulated weight. Ethan felt something shift inside him that had nothing to do with temperature. He stared at the building, letting his eyes trace the angles, the way snow had drifted against its sides, the way the doorframe leaned just slightly off-center. This was not a cabin built for comfort. It was functional, purpose-driven, forgotten. Hunter rose and moved beside him, ears forward, posture alert but calm. The dog's gaze flicked between Ethan and the structure, waiting for cues that did not need to be spoken. The air around the building felt different, heavier, as if the ground itself remembered footsteps that no longer came. Ethan took another step, then stopped, his boots sinking into softer snow near the edge of what had once been a cleared path. A rescue station. Old, abandoned. The kind built when people still believed that leaving something behind for others was worth the effort. Ethan stood there for a long moment, the wind brushing past him now without urgency, the storm having said what it came to say. He did not move toward the structure yet. He simply acknowledged its presence, the way one acknowledges a truth that has been waiting patiently. The mountain had taken its turn. It had tested endurance, balance, restraint. And now, as the last heavy gust faded into a steady, manageable wind, it offered something in return. Not relief, not safety, but possibility. Ethan adjusted the strap of his pack and looked down at Hunter, who met his gaze without hesitation. Snow continued to fall, lighter now, settling into grooves and corners, softening edges without erasing them. The structure stood silent ahead. Its purpose, unclear but undeniable. Ethan took a breath, steady and measured, and prepared to move again. The door resisted him at first, not violently, but with the stubborn reluctance of something that had learned to expect nothing. Ethan leaned his weight into it, boots braced against the snow-packed threshold, until the hinges answered with a long, tired groan that seemed to rise from deep inside the structure. The sound lingered after the door gave way, stretching through the cold air like an exhale that had been held for years. Snow slipped in along the floor as the opening widened, tracing pale lines across worn wood. Ethan stepped inside without haste, as if rushing might break the spell of whatever still remained. The air carried the smell of dust, old oil, and something harder to name, promises that had been made with confidence and then left to age in silence. Light filtered in weakly through narrow windows clouded by frost, laying thin, uneven bands across the room. Along one wall stood a row of folding cots, their frames dulled by time, fabrics stiff and colorless from neglect. A radio console occupied the far corner, its face cracked, knobs stiff and unmoving, wires disappearing into the wall as though trying to hide. Maps clung to the walls, yellowed and curling at the edges, trails traced in pencil by hands that once believed vigilance mattered. Ethan moved slowly through the space, his boots sounding too loud against the floorboards. He ran his fingers along the edge of one cot, then another, feeling the grooves worn smooth by repeated use. On the wall near the maps, a small emblem caught his eye, barely visible beneath a layer of dust. He brushed it clean with the sleeve of his jacket, revealing faded lettering and a familiar symbol. Search and rescue. The words looked fragile now, as if they might flake away if asked to explain themselves. Hunter entered behind him, stepping across the threshold with a different kind of care. His tail lowered, movements subdued, posture respectful in a way that felt almost human. He sniffed the air once, then once more, cataloging scents that spoke of long-absent people and extinguished purpose. The dog moved quietly, as if aware that this place had its own rules, its own silence that did not welcome interruption. Ethan noticed the way Hunter avoided stepping on certain spots, the way he chose corners and edges, leaving the center of the room undisturbed. Someone had cared enough to build this, enough to haul materials up the mountain, to install equipment, to mark routes and track weather. Enough to stay through storms and nights when the radio crackled with nothing but static. The care lingered in the details, in the way the maps were aligned, in the hooks still mounted on the walls where gear once hung. And then, just as clearly, there was absence. The unmistakable gap left when care is no longer enough to justify staying. Ethan approached the radio, resting his hand on the edge of the console without turning it on. The surface was cold beneath his glove, unyielding, familiar in a way that tightened something in his chest. He imagined hands like his own adjusting those knobs years ago, listening for voices that might never answer. For a moment, the room felt crowded with the quiet persistence of people who had once believed they were needed. Then, the feeling receded, leaving only dust and echoes. Beneath the radio table, partly hidden by a fallen chair, Ethan noticed a small ledger. He crouched and pulled it free, the pages bending and sighing as he lifted it. The cover was warped, stained by moisture, the spine held together with tape that had long since lost its grip. When he opened it, the paper crackled softly, ink blurred into uneven shadows where words had once been clear. Dates marched down the pages in careful lines, entries growing shorter as time went on. The final entry stopped mid-sentence, no signature, no explanation, just a line that ended as if the writer had been called away and never returned. Ethan closed the book gently, as though abrupt movement might erase what remained. Outside, the wind whispered through broken boards, a sound low and intimate, like a secret the mountain had grown tired of keeping. He held the ledger for another moment, then set it on the table beneath the radio. Ethan sank onto one of the cots, the frame creaking under his weight. The mattress gave little support, pressing back with the honesty of something that had never promised comfort. He rested his elbows on his knees, let his gaze drift across the room again, seeing it now with different eyes. This place had not failed. It had been left behind. The distinction settled heavily, reshaping thoughts he had carried for years without naming. People liked to believe that systems failed because they deserved to, that abandonment was always the result of weakness or poor choices. But the truth, as Ethan saw it here, was quieter and more troubling. Sometimes things were abandoned because attention moved elsewhere, because the cost of caring became inconvenient. Sometimes what failed was not the structure, but the willingness to remain present. The realization did not bring anger. It brought recognition. Hunter sat down beside Ethan's feet, his body close but not pressing, eyes steady and alert. He watched Ethan's face, reading the shifts in expression with the same patience he had shown on the mountain. There was no expectation in his gaze, no demand that Ethan act or decide. He was simply there, solid and unyielding, a constant in a room defined by absence. Ethan reached down and rested his hand briefly on the dog's head, fingers sinking into warm fur. For the first time since arriving in the mountains, something unfamiliar stirred inside Ethan. It was not grief, and it was not anger. It felt steadier than either, quieter, but with more weight. Purpose did not announce itself with urgency. It settled, testing whether it would be acknowledged. Ethan straightened slightly as if responding to a change in balance he could not see. His eyes returned to the radio. Up close, the damage was clear, cracks in the casing, corrosion along the edges, wires stiff with age. It looked dead, the way machines did when they had been ignored long enough to forget their function. Ethan leaned forward, studying the knobs, the dials, the faded markings around the frequency selector. He did not touch it yet. He simply looked, measuring possibility against reality. Outside, the wind softened further, its voice dropping to a low murmur that brushed against the walls without insistence. Light shifted through the frosted windows, brightening one corner of the room just enough to reveal dust motes drifting lazily in the air. The rescue station seemed to breathe with the change, as if responding to attention after a long period of neglect. Ethan's gaze lingered on the radio, his jaw setting with quiet resolve. Old, cracked, dead, or maybe not. Night arrived earlier than Ethan expected, folding itself over the rescue station with a deep blue stillness that muted even the wind. The sky pressed low, heavy with clouds, and the last light drained slowly from the snow outside, leaving only outlines in shadow. Inside, the station felt smaller in the dark, its walls absorbing sound rather than reflecting it. Ethan stood for a moment near the door, listening, allowing the silence to settle into his bones. This was the kind of quiet that did not ask questions, only waited. He worked by the narrow beam of his headlamp, the light cutting clean lines through dust and darkness. His fingers ached quickly, numbness creeping in where gloves ended and skin met cold metal. Still, his movements were steady, deliberate, guided by habit rather than urgency. He shoveled snow away from the door, reinforcing its edges, testing each hinge as if the structure itself needed reassurance. Every small repair felt like an answer to a question no one had asked out loud. Hunter slept nearby, curled close to the wall where the wind could not reach him. His breathing was slow and even, rising and falling with the certainty of something unbroken. From time to time, he lifted his head, ears angling toward the sound of shifting air outside, then settled again once the pattern held. He did not need to be told when to rest or when to watch. His trust was quiet and complete. Ethan moved through the night in fragments of light and shadow, reconnecting wires where insulation had cracked, tightening bolts loosened by years of neglect. Some things resisted, metal refusing to turn, connections corroded beyond recognition. He accepted those losses without frustration, setting aside what could not be saved. Other parts surprised him, responding to pressure, to patience, to a second attempt taken at the right angle. It was not progress so much as dialogue, a slow conversation between what had been left behind and what remained willing. At some point, he paused and realized he did not know why he was still working. No signal had been sent, no voice had answered, no promise waited on the other side of effort. No one would know if he stopped, if he slept through the night and let the station return to silence. The thought passed through him without weight, and just as quietly, it left. He kept working. Outside, the night deepened, stars hidden behind layers of cloud that reflected faint traces of moonlight. Snow fell lightly now, almost politely, settling onto surfaces without insistence. Ethan stepped out briefly, stretching his shoulders, letting the cold bite into his face and wake what fatigue threatened to dull. He looked up at the dark outline of the mountains, their presence heavy but no longer hostile. They stood as they always had, indifferent to intention but attentive to action. Near dawn, the sky shifted, the blue thinning at its edges until pale gray began to seep through. Ethan climbed onto the roof with careful footing, his breath fogging the air as he reached for the antenna. Ice clung stubbornly to metal, forcing him to work slowly, breaking it away piece by piece. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the accumulated cost of cold and effort. He did not hurry. The morning had waited long enough. When the antenna finally moved, aligning itself with the horizon rather than resisting it, Ethan felt a subtle release, as if tension he had not fully acknowledged had eased. He climbed down and returned inside, bringing with him the thin light of early morning. The station looked different in dawn's clarity, less like a relic and more like a place suspended between what it had been and what it might still become. Dust floated in the air, illuminated briefly before settling again. Ethan stood in front of the radio, his headlamp now unnecessary. He rested his hand on the console, feeling the cold surface beneath his palm. He turned the main knob slowly, listening as static rushed in, filling the room with sharp, uneven noise. He adjusted the frequency, pausing between movements, allowing the radio time to respond. Static again. Then, nothing. Silence pressed in. Heavier now than before. Ethan leaned closer, eyes narrowing, adjusting a dial by fractions rather than degrees. His breath slowed, measured, each exhale controlled as if sound itself might disrupt the moment. The station seemed to hold its breath with him, the walls and floor waiting in shared attention. Then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, something answered. A crackle broke through the silence, weak and uneven, like a voice clearing its throat after years of disuse. Ethan froze, fingers hovering over the controls, afraid that movement might erase the sound. He adjusted again, barely, and the signal sharpened just enough to reveal fragments, not words yet, just presence. Then a voice emerged, broken and distant, carried on interference and effort. It trembled not with fear, but with exhaustion, the sound of someone clinging to function by habit alone. "Lost trail," the voice said, each word separated by static and breath. A pause followed, longer this time. "Can't feel my hands." Ethan closed his eyes. The room fell away, replaced by memory and understanding layered together without conflict. He knew that voice without knowing the person. He knew the cadence, the way the words fought their way out despite cold and fatigue. His hand moved to the transmit button, pressing it with steady pressure. When he spoke, his voice did not rise. "Hold on." 2 words, no explanation, no reassurance layered with false promise. just enough to anchor the voice on the other end to something real. The radio hissed softly in response, the signal wavering but present. Ethan released the button and waited, listening to the space between sounds. Hunter lifted his head sharply, ears erect, eyes focused on the radio. He stood and moved closer, posture alert but calm, as if recognizing a shift in the environment that mattered. His tail was still, his attention absolute. The station no longer felt empty, it felt occupied. The morning light strengthened, spilling through the windows and across the floor in slow, deliberate patterns. Snow outside reflected the glow upward, brightening the room until its edges softened. Ethan remained at the radio, listening, adjusting when necessary, his movements economical and precise. He did not rush to fill the silence, he allowed it to exist alongside the signal. Something inside him settled into place. Not triumph, not relief. A quieter realization. He had not come here to disappear. He had come here because something in him refused to believe that places, like people, should be abandoned simply because they were inconvenient to reach. The mountains had taken much from him over the years, certainty, ease, parts of himself he could no longer name. But they had not taken this. Outside, the wind shifted again, gentler now, brushing against the station without demand. Hunter sat beside Ethan, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, his presence solid and grounding. The radio crackled once more, the voice on the other end still there, still trying. Ethan adjusted the dial slightly, improving the signal by degrees rather than leaps. He stayed with it, patient and focused. The storm had taken many things from Ethan. It had taken people he could not save, moments he could not recover, nights that still found him awake without reason. But it had not taken his ability to answer when called, even if the call came late, even if it came from someone he had never met. As the signal held, thin but alive, Ethan remained exactly where he was meant to be. They reached the man before the mountain finished deciding what would become of him. He lay half buried in snow, body folded inward, as if trying to conserve the last warmth it had left, breath shallow but present. His skin was pale, lips cracked, eyes unfocused, yet stubbornly open, clinging to consciousness by habit more than hope. Cold had already taken much from him, but not everything. Not yet. Ethan moved with a calm that did not rush the moment, the kind that comes only when a body knows exactly what to do. He checked the man's pulse, steady but weak, then wrapped him carefully, insulating what the mountain had tried to strip away. Hunter stayed close, alert and silent, positioning himself against the wind to block what little strength it still carried. There was no panic between them, no wasted motion, only practiced coordination shaped by necessity rather than heroism. Time passed in measured fragments as they stabilized the man and waited. The radio remained their quiet companion, its soft hum anchoring the station to the outside world. When rescue finally arrived hours later, it did so without spectacle. No raised voices cut through the air, no dramatic gestures demanded attention. There were only nods exchanged, hands briefly clasped, eyes meeting with understanding that did not need words. The rescuers worked efficiently, loading the man onto a stretcher with care that mirrored Ethan's own. One of them paused, looking at Ethan as if to ask something, then thought better of it. Gratitude showed itself in simpler ways. A look held a second longer than necessary, a hand pressed to his shoulder before turning away. Ethan watched as the stretcher disappeared into the snow-bright distance, the sound of boots fading until only wind remained. When they offered him a ride down the mountain, Ethan shook his head. The gesture was small, almost dismissive, but final. He did not explain himself. He did not feel the need to justify the choice. Some decisions arrive quietly, fully formed, and resist translation into reasons. He stayed. Days unfolded into weeks with a steady rhythm that did not announce its significance. The rescue station began to breathe again, its presence shifting from relic to refuge without ceremony. Ethan cleared trails where snow had erased them, marking paths with care so others would not have to rely on memory alone. The radio spoke more often now, voices crackling in and out, some asking for help, others simply checking in, reassured by the fact that someone was listening. People passed through in different forms, a hiker who misjudged daylight and found himself grateful for shelter, A hunter whose truck refused to start in the cold, surprised to find warmth waiting. Once, a family arrived by chance, unaware of how close silence had come to claiming them, laughing nervously as they warmed their hands and moved on. Ethan watched them go without comment, satisfaction settling quietly rather than seeking recognition. He never explained why he stayed. Those who asked received only a nod or a brief acknowledgement, enough to end the question without answering it. Some things did not benefit from explanation. Purpose, he had learned, rarely survived interrogation. The mountains observed all of this without interference. They remained vast and indifferent, snow shifting along their slopes in slow, patient patterns. But they no longer tested Ethan with the same insistence. The storms still came, the cold still bit, but there was a sense of equilibrium now, as if an agreement had been reached without being spoken aloud. One evening, snow fell gently, flakes drifting down with unhurried grace. The sky was clear enough to reveal a scatter of stars, distant and steady, watching from places untouched by weather. Ethan sat outside the station on the narrow porch, the wood beneath him creaking softly with age. Hunter lay beside him, his body warm and solid, head resting on his paws as his eyes tracked the slow movement of snow. Inside, the radio hummed with quiet consistency, a sound that had become part of the station's heartbeat. Ethan listened to it without actively hearing, comforted by its presence rather than its message. He thought about the lessons the mountain had offered, not as trials, but as truths revealed over time. First, that silence was not emptiness, but space. Space for attention, for responsibility, for choice. Second, that calm was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. And finally, that staying, when leaving would be easier, was sometimes the most honest form of courage. He did not look back down the trail that night. There was no need to measure distance anymore. What mattered was here, in the steady fall of snow, in the warmth shared between man and dog, in the radio signal stretching outward into the dark. The world beyond the mountains would continue to move, to forget, to demand explanations. This place asked for none. As the evening deepened, a faint sound carried across the air, static shifting on the radio followed by a voice too distant to fully form. Ethan rose slowly, listening, his posture attentive but unhurried. The sound was not urgent, not yet, but it was there, a reminder rather than a demand. He stepped back inside, Hunter following without hesitation. The door closed behind them with a familiar, weary sound, sealing warmth against the cold. Outside, the mountains watched, unmoving and silent. This time, they did not judge. They simply allowed the signal to continue, traveling farther than anyone could see. By the time the light thinned and the mountains settled back into their long stillness, I realized that today had not ended the way I once imagined journeys were supposed to end. There was no finish line waiting for me, no moment that demanded applause or explanation. What remained instead was a quiet sense of alignment, as if something inside me had finally matched the rhythm of the land around it. The cold no longer felt like an enemy, and the silence no longer pressed against my chest. It simply existed, the way it always had, patient and honest. I learned that survival is rarely about strength alone. It is about attention, the willingness to notice small changes, faint signals, and moments that ask you to slow down instead of push forward. I learned that calm is not something you find after danger has passed, but something you choose while danger is still present. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that staying, when walking away would be easier, can become an act of healing rather than sacrifice. Somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of the mountains as obstacles and began to see them as witnesses. They did not care who I had been before I arrived, but they paid close attention to what I chose to do once I was here. In their vastness, my past felt smaller, less demanding, as if it no longer needed to be carried everywhere I went. The land did not forgive or condemn, it simply reflected back whatever was brought into it. Beside me, my dog moved through this place with a clarity I had forgotten was possible. His trust was never loud, never conditional, and through him I remembered what it meant to remain present without explanation. Together, we learned the terrain not just with our feet but with patience, listening, and restraint. The bond between us did not save the mountain, and the mountain did not save us. What endured was the space we created between effort and acceptance. As night returned and the signal carried on into the dark, I understood that this was not an ending in the usual sense. It was a pause, gentle, deliberate, where one path closes softly behind me and another waits, unmarked, just beyond the light.